morning. Good morning. I'm Debbie Wasserman Schultz. I represent Florida's 25th Congressional District in the United States House of Representatives. Thank you all for joining me. I'm here today to announce and introduce my guest for the State of the Union address, who will help me shine a vital spotlight on how in vitro fertilization expands the options for families, for people hoping to start a family, and that the recent court decision and dangerous legislation are already blocking couples from sometimes their only pathway to start a family. But we also want to discuss a lesser-known reality, which is that IVF is critical to help end the genetic cycle of deadly disease from being passed on to future generations, particularly cancer. First, it's critical that voters understand that this threat to IVF is part of a Republican march to a national abortion ban, and it's one that many of us saw coming. And the impact of the Alabama ruling is already being felt in Florida. Second, there is legislation that could end this threat, so it's vital that Congress pass the Access to Family Building Act to protect IVF and all reproductive care. But I'm going to come back to that shortly. Here's how we got here. The Alabama Supreme Court just ruled that embryos are children, inflicting legal chaos and uncertainty onto doctors, fertility clinics, and prospective parents there, and its misguided rhetoric is reverberating through other states. This decision is yet another attack on women's freedoms, full stop. The Alabama court majority relied on two things. One was an extreme religious reading of the Bible that was applied to our Constitution. Its concurring majority opinion erodes any barrier between church and state. The second weapon they used was the legal ruling that Donald Trump and Republicans used to destroy our reproductive rights when Roe v. Wade was overturned. The Supreme Court's Dobbs ruling actually said that states have a legitimate interest in preserving and protecting prenatal life. Dobbs basically handed the fetal personhood movement a legal weapon by bolstering its absurd claim that embryos are full-fledged children, and nearly a dozen states have similar laws on the books already. This, of course, defies common and medical sense. But let me tell you what Dobbs and the anti-IVF laws it inspires will mean for families like mine, who see IVF and saw IVF as the realization of the promise of hope. For starters, let's be clear. Infertility is a disease. It affects 1 of every 8 American couples. Throughout my public life, I fought to treat it like a disease, to lift the stigma from those struggling with fertility. And I have my own IVF story. Some of you might have heard me tell it before. My husband and I had difficulty conceiving when I was just 29 years old. We tried for a solid year at an age when both of us should easily have been able to become pregnant. But I was finally able to conceive through IVF, and our twins, Rebecca and Jake, are both healthy young adults now, and we later had our third child naturally. Seeing this struggle up close, I fought for years to help expand access to health insurance coverage for the prohibitively expensive fertility treatments that make it only accessible to those who can afford it. And as a breast cancer survivor, which I was diagnosed when I was 41, I'm also especially concerned how diagnosis and vital treatment affects a survivor's ability to start a family. For so many survivors like me, with a BRCA gene mutation or other forms of cancer, IVF can be a godsend. But yet now it's clouded in uncertainty. And the angst doesn't stop there. My daughters and son will need to be tested on whether or not they carry the BRCA2 gene mutation, which I do carry. That caused a dramatic increase in the likelihood I would get cancer, which I eventually did, and it also caused a higher risk for multiple other kinds of cancer. If my children carry the genetic mutation, my daughters would be affected more directly, but my son, obviously, for his potential descendants, would be impacted as well. IVF has to be accessible to them when they one day plan to have children. And thanks to genetic research, embryos can be tested to see whether the embryo carries the genetic mutation. And as a result, an embryo that does not carry the genetic mutation can be implanted. That ends the cycle of increased cancer risk generationally in my family and in literally tens of thousands of families. This ruling gives personhood to embryos, and it will help keep cancer continuing in more families, and it will result in more cancer deaths. The Alabama Supreme Court decision and the push for a national abortion ban will also make fertility preservation for cancer patients harder. Imagine you're facing life-altering cancer treatments and knowing that even if you pull through, having a child for you may be put out of reach because the Supreme Court ruling in Alabama and other laws that are pending in states across the country would stop you, literally prohibit you from in vitro fertilization. It's these anxious, desperate, and frightened families who extreme Republicans are torturing by targeting IVF. And let me just tell you, the emotional toll that in vitro fertilization and other fertility treatments and the hope to start a family and the cycle of failure that often occurs is nothing less than torture. That's exactly why my cancer survivorship bill expands Medicaid coverage, so cancer patients aren't forced to forfeit parenthood to stay alive. Any state with so-called personhood laws can be the next Alabama, where couples will experience the chaos over how, if, and when they can start a family. In fact, the Liberty Council filed a notice with Florida Supreme Court saying the Alabama decision, including Parker's concurrence, should factor into its pending decision on a proposed constitutional amendment that voters are being asked to support on abortion rights here in Florida. And it won't end there. All women deserve the freedom to control our own bodies and our future, and choosing IVF, birth control, or abortion is our decision, not one that judges or politicians decide. Why should a judge or a politician decide whether any woman can become a mother, whether any couple can become parents? So we have to fight for our freedoms and make sure all of our friends and neighbors know the stakes. In Washington, we have to pass the Access to Family Building Act and prevent legislation like the Life and Conception Act that Republicans in Washington are supporting. We have 125 Republican members of Congress who are co-sponsors of that bill, which would declare that life begins at conception and embed that in federal law. Embryos are considered conception. And so that would apply to embryos, giving politicians control over what happens at that stage. And now I want to introduce Stacey Lieberman, because women's and lives' futures hang in the balance. She's going to share her story, but I know IVF was an option that she treasured in her motherhood journey, and I want to make sure that she has a chance to talk to you about that journey and why she's joining me at the State of the Union this week. Stacey.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Stacey Lieberman, and it's an honor to be here with Congresswoman Wasserman Schultz to tell you why I believe in vitro fertilization is so important. My husband and I live in Hollywood, Florida with our two beautiful children, ages 9 and 10. We got married in our very late 30s. We immediately started to try having a family. After 8 months of trying with no pregnancy, we found ourselves in the office of the first fertility doctor. That led us to undergo 6 rounds of in vitro fertilization, often referred to as IVF, over a 2-year period. Doctors advised that I was of advanced maternal age with a dwindling supply of healthy eggs. For many women like me over the age of 35 and trying to have a family, IVF may be our only option to have children. When the IVF did not result in a pregnancy, doctors said my uterine lining was too thin to successfully implant an embryo. However, we do have 2 children. Our son was adopted from birth in 2013, and 8 months later, in 2014, I gave birth to a healthy baby girl conceived naturally. But I have another very important reason why IVF is a vital option for families to have children. Last year in February 2023, at my synagogue's breast cancer awareness event, I was tested for BRCA or BRCA, the BRCA mutation, and other genetic mutations that increase one's risk of breast and other forms of cancer. I got tested on a whim. I wasn't anxious because I did not believe there was any history of cancer in my family. At the end of February 2023, my phone rang, and it was a genetic counselor advising me that my test results were in, and I was positive for the BRCA1 mutation. At that moment, I had a 50% increased risk of developing breast cancer and a 40 to 60% increased risk of developing ovarian cancer. Well, those risks were too high for me with young children. So last fall, I had a prophylactic double mastectomy and a prophylactic hysterectomy with removal of my ovaries and fallopian tubes to significantly decrease and virtually delete my risks for breast and ovarian cancer. But my daughter is now 9. She has a 50-50 chance of inheriting the BRCA mutation from me. I was not the only one affected in my family. My sister was tested after me, and she also carries the BRCA1 mutation. And she had the same prophylactic surgeries that I did last year. She has 3 teenage sons. They have a 50-50 chance of inheriting the BRCA mutation from her. If my daughter or her sons are positive for the BRCA1 mutation, we will make sure they are monitored and get the treatment that they need. And although it is years away, we are already thinking about our grandchildren. We already love them, we want to protect them, and we don't want them to have the BRCA1 mutation and go through what we did. So if my daughter or any of my nephews carry the BRCA1 genetic mutation, it is vital that they and their future spouses have the option to undergo in vitro fertilization with pre-implantation genetic testing of their embryos. They will want to implant only those embryos that do not carry the BRCA1 mutation, thereby removing from their future generations the increased risks of cancer that the BRCA mutation causes, breast and ovarian cancer in girls and prostate cancer in boys. IVF with pre-implantation genetic testing is the only way for my family, current and future, and so many others, thousands of others, hundreds of thousands of others, to break the cycle of deadly diseases like cancer being passed from one generation to the next. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Stacey. And I want to conclude by really just saying one last thing and then open it up to questions. Florida's anti-IVF bills are just one of the many problems that we need to fix, and one of those measures closely mirrors the Alabama rule. That means that this problem may also be coming to our state unless we put a stop to it. Women need reproductive freedom and health, not lawmakers and judges dictating what they can do with their bodies. Whether it's Florida, Alabama, or any other state, IVF must be protected across the entire nation for all families. So-called fetal personhood bills must be halted, and women must be able to start a family in whichever way they see fit. We need to pass federal legislation ensuring these principles, and I'm proud that Stacey will join me in Congress this week for the State of the Union address, so we can both share our stories together. The last thing I want to say about this before we take questions is there are Republicans that seem to be racing to publicly state that they support in vitro fertilization and they support protecting it. Yet 125 Republicans, as I said, are sponsors of a bill that says that life begins at conception. That is what would halt IVF and halt the ability of families like mine and Stacey's from being able to make sure that we can stop generational passage of cancer in its tracks. That's unacceptable. And so what these Republicans are saying they support is meaningless when they have their name on a bill that would actually stand in the way of ending generational cancer and deciding for families whether or not and how we can have children. So we're happy to take any questions.
Can you talk about the federal legislation you want to see passed and how it would prevent things like the ruling in Alabama?
Yeah, I mean, the Access to Family Building Act would essentially embed in vitro fertilization and access to it in federal law. So it would say that federal law allows in vitro fertilization, but it would also essentially say that it would end the notion of fetal person, where you would have it say in federal law, an embryo is not a person.
So does this say that it's a crime then to get rid of the embryos or dispose of the embryos?
Does what say?
The bill or whatever it is that the Republicans are trying to pass I mean, or protect, or.
Oh, the life begins at conception.
Right, I mean, what exactly, I mean, are we talking about, if we dispose of an embryo, that's a crime, or?
Yeah, I mean, I need to get the specific details on this bill, but in Alabama, the Supreme Court decision criminalizes, it literally criminalizes, when they're declared fetal personhood, it criminalizes the, the usage of an embryo for, I think, anything other than implanting it in a woman. And it allowed lawsuits, it allows criminal penalties, so, yeah, I mean, that's how far the Alabama ruling went, and the Life Begins at Conception Act also has similar provisions in it. But anything, what we should not be doing is, in any law, in any court decision, we should not be dictating to families on how they can grow their families. We shouldn't be dictating reproductive choices for families in state law. And judges and politicians should not be making those decisions.